Hey guys, kind of out here in the middle of nowhere looking for somewhere to film. I found this out here randomly, so it's not. I guess this is good a place as any. Wow, hey everybody, welcome to the Dan Doug channel. It's pretty quiet out here. I found this abandoned campsite out in the middle of nowhere. The fire was already going, so I mean, that's not a bad sign, is it? Anyway, today we're going to be talking about witches. Many traditions from all around the world include magically endowed persons, healers, diviners, fortune tellers, or practitioners of the dark arts. Latin American, African, Asian, South American, North American, Nordic, and European cultures. Pretty much every cultural heritage has some kind of tradition like this. But today we're going to be focusing on the concept of the Western European witch. Kind of the one that you're familiar with. You know, the hooked nose, the black cloak, flying on a broom. I know you've seen her. I know you know what I'm talking about. She's a meme. She's an icon. Where did she come from? Why does she have the characteristics that she has? The hat, the broom, and most importantly, if magic is not real, how did she become so popular? How were so many people fooled? And what role does she play in our stories, both fictional and real? Why did we invent her, and why do we keep telling stories about her after all these years? Part 1, Origins. On the one hand, if you look up the etymology of the word witch or pagan, you will find that all of these terms have roots in the Christian tradition. These were used to designate groups that were either heretical or non-Christian. It's important to note that a heretic and a non-Christian would be different in this context. From the Christian church's point of view, a heretic is someone who claims to be practicing Christianity, but is doing so improperly without an orthodox faith. A non-Christian would just be someone who belongs to a different faith tradition. But in either case, terms like these, witch, pagan, these are all terms of antithesis, meaning they were meant to designate a person who is not a part of this Christian group. In the ancient world, pagan, for example, was kind of a catch-all term used to describe anyone who was not a Christian or a Jewish person, usually a Roman citizen who practiced polytheism after the rise of Christianity. Similarly, witch was a general term in Germanic countries for someone who might vaguely practice magic, a diviner or a soothsayer, or someone who beguiles or bewitches someone. Witch hunts were not a medieval phenomenon. The medieval church coexisted alongside indigenous European groups in relative harmony compared to what came later. It was the rise of the early modern period, or the 15th century, which gave rise to the witch crazes that we're familiar with today, in places like Germany and Switzerland and Britain. And this was true for the Inquisitions in general as well. It was more of an early modern phenomenon rather than a medieval one. In the late 15th century, Johannes Nider, a German theologian, wrote a tract called the Formicarius, which for the first time in European history put forward a serious attempt to define witchcraft. He saw it as an outgrowth of the church's inability to minister to its lay population and the native Germanic lands where a portion of the people still practice forms of indigenous shamanistic religions. Nider was responding to a diffuse set of pagan practices which were not necessarily unified in any way. His Formicarius, in part, was an attempt to figure out what these practices were exactly. And so he interviewed inquisitors and secular authorities about what they had uncovered during trials and hearings of various kinds throughout Switzerland. He heard stories of making pacts with the devil, night flights or gatherings called sabbats, where adherents would cavort with demons and all kinds of orgiastic rituals and ceremonies. And it should be noted here that these were thought to happen in dreamlike states or visions, not in reality. Also using harmful magic or maleficium, which would cause storms or deaths of children or destroying crops, among other things like causing male impotence. That was a big one, apparently. Using potions and ointment made from unbaptized children, you know, typical witch things. But witch hunts and trials were not evenly distributed throughout Europe. They crop up most notably in Germany and Switzerland, in areas where central church authority was not very strong, and secular courts were gaining power. Official Catholic doctrine since the 9th century stated that belief in witches was superstitious and shouldn't be indulged in. This partly explains why witch hunts weren't really a thing in the Middle Ages. It's kind of hard to hunt something you don't believe in. But as the authority of the Catholic Catholic Church weakened in areas like Germany and Switzerland, this gave rise to petty authorities with less refined theological views, and they were more susceptible to dealing with disturbances in their provinces with a little bit more of a heavy hand. Add in a crop failure or two, the death of a child, economic turmoil, and it doesn't take long before somebody starts to get scapegoated. The Church's role in prosecuting witches is complicated. For most of its history, witches and witchcraft were simply a superstition to be avoided. But as the Protestant Reformation got underway, political power became more diffuse and complicated. How much the Church itself is to blame for witch hunts is a hotly debated historical topic. But to the extent the Church was involved, the hypocrisy here is hard to miss. A religion based off the unjust killing of a man scapegoated by hypocritical religious rulers doesn't lend itself neatly to doing the exact same thing to other outgroups, usually women on the outside of society without much political or economic power. And before we continue on with the history, I'm going to be doing a little bit of social theory here because it's going to become very relevant at the end of this video, so bear with me for just a moment. Philosopher, scholar, and social historian René Girard talked a lot about Christianity. One of the things that he stated was the uniqueness of Christianity was its revolutionizing of the concept of sacrifice. Throughout ancient cultures, it was common for cycles of reciprocal violence between warring tribes and nations to get out of hand. One tribe would injure another, and then acts of revenge would take hold until entire cultures were wiped out. Eventually, along came a ritualistic innovation that changed this pattern. Rather than locating the problems of the tribe externally to one's enemies, which would likely lead to an escalating pattern of violence and war, instead, the problems would be located as either with the fates or the will of the gods. So when a tribe would be in a state of toil or dismay if crops were not good, or if they had suffered a bad defeat on the battlefield, the way to alleviate this negative state would be to satiate the gods through sacrifice, offering something to bring oneself back into proper relationship with the gods. In Leviticus 16, the ancient Israelites had a practice where the priest would symbolically impute the sins of the people onto a goat and release it into the wilderness to die. This was called scapegoating. You probably recognize this pattern because it's still very prevalent in all kinds of human patterns of behavior. Well, according to Girard's analysis, Christianity took this one step further by claiming that God had himself initiated an act of self-sacrifice, encouraging his followers to do likewise, to love their enemies, to turn the other cheek. And as was mentioned before, not only this, but the act of violence initiated against him was done by religious leaders for religious reasons. From René Girard's standpoint, this drama shifts the focus of scapegoating from the point of view of the group, which typical myths and mythologies would focus on the group gaining a victory over its enemies. Christianity reverses this narrative and puts it from the point of view of the victim of this crime. And not only that, but in this case, the victim of this crime is God himself. Girard sees Christianity as an important step in the development of how societies channel violent impulses. Rather than redirecting acts of vengeance onto a neighboring tribe or within the group itself, onto outsiders or scapegoats through ritualistic sacrifice, instead, Christians are to take up their cross daily, love their enemies, forgive wrongs done to them, and turn the other cheek. If anyone has ever done anything wrong to you before, you understand how difficult this is to actually do. But it is what the Christian religion clearly teaches. Now, if we go back to the case of the witch trials, you will see just how upside down this whole paradigm was. Not only were the witch hunters not upholding Christian ethics by executing probably very many innocent victims, and not only were they doing so in a way similar to Christ's killers through religious justifications and hypocrisy, but they were specifically doing it in the name of religion that, at least in the Girardian interpretation, had put an end to reciprocal violence. So in condemning witches and committing violent acts against them, and specifically for trying them as pagans, who was practicing the real paganism really? The witches or the people who were bringing scapegoating back? Which brings us to the issue of gender. Why women? Why were women the majority of people accused of witchcraft in the early modern period? And maybe even more interestingly, why were so many witchcraft accusations made also by women. One common answer to this is, of course, sexism and misogyny. And while this is definitely partially true, I've never been totally satisfied with this explanation because the practice of witchcraft and the witch trials in general were just such weird and unique things to happen in the first place. To me, anyway, it seems like the conventional methods of social analysis are just not enough to explain these bizarre historical events. One interesting thing to add here is that in certain places, men were convicted of witchcraft more often, although mostly it was women. Russia, Ukraine, and Iceland are all examples of this. And if we're saying that the reason women were accused of witchcraft is because of patriarchal practices, I think you'd have a hard time making the argument that places like Russia and Iceland were less patriarchal than places like Switzerland and Germany at the time. Some of the blame for this can be laid at the feet of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is written by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor who was hugely influential at the time. It was published in 1486 and was a guide for how to deal with the witch problem. In it, there were many passages of stunning, gender-based reasoning that would make even the most based red pillar today probably blush. Another thing to consider in general when you're thinking about the gender dynamics in the practice of witchcraft is why today there are more practicing witches who are women than men, especially when these types of persecutions are no longer happening. Many studies have shown that the majority of witches practicing today are women, and this poses an interesting question. Are the majority of witches today women because of this legacy of persecuting women, and this is just kind of like an up yours to the history of that? Or does witchcraft represent a real feminine phenomenon? In other words, with or without persecution, would the majority of witchcraft practitioners have been women anyway? During the 1970s, feminists like Mary Daly sought to revive the term witch toward female empowerment. Daly is a fascinating historical figure that deserves a video all to her own, but her attitude toward religion and men represents the typical attitude of Western witchcraft in the 20th century. And if you guys think J.K. Rowling is a TERF, boy, Mary Daly makes J.K. Rowling look like TERF child's play. The growth of witchcraft in the 1960s and 70s was a conscious reaction against conservatism, which advocated for more traditional family structures in reaction to the social upheaval of the 1960s. This led to a dramatic rise in the practice of witchcraft in the modern Western world, which is still taking place today. Today, there are more witches in America than there are Presbyterians. From the perspectives of recent outgrowths of feminist thought around witchcraft, the Christian church and the Western world that predated it, the Greeks and the Romans, together are a kind of patriarchal hegemony that, in their version of the story, overtook and unfairly oppressed the indigenous populations of Europe, which practiced pagan witchcraft and shamanistic religions. And of course, very conveniently for the witches in this case, these indigenous cultures were havens of 21st century progressive politics, leftist feminist utopias that were crushed under the boot of the domineering forces of medieval Christendom, which of course is quite the oversimplification. Efforts to try and recover a monolithic unified pagan practice in pre-Christian Europe has proved largely unfruitful. In reality, it was a complex web of people with diverse practices rather than a unified system. Professor Diane Purkis from Oxford University states it clearly: nobody was goddess worshipping during the period of the witch hunts, or if they were, they have left no trace in the historical records. Despite the beliefs of lawyers, historians, and politicians, there was no real pagan witchcraft, though there were some residual paganism in a very few trials. What did exist was folk religions and folk magic, a messy, unsystematic mix of Christian and pre-Christian beliefs that had blended together over centuries. This included belief in charms, curses, protective magic, herbal remedies, and folk healing traditions, superstitions about the evil eye, fairies and spirits, and long-standing belief that certain women traveled at night to nocturnal revels with supernatural beings. But these folk beliefs weren't an organized pagan religion, they were a mishmash of local traditions, Christian teachings and superstitions that ordinary people practiced alongside their Christianity, not instead of it. Much time and effort has been spent trying to make the historical case that these indigenous European practices were largely benevolent and harmless. Whether you believe that or not is largely a product of your own preconceptions and your own historical research, in which historical sources you tend to prioritize over others, as this is a very active and developing area of historical research currently. But as you can see, you can kind of understand why modern practitioners of witchcraft kind of want that to be the case, because if there's not some large patriarchal political hegemony to fight against, then what is the point really of being a witch in the first place? Part 2, icons. We've talked about the historical origins of the witch, but what about the image that's presented to us? Hooked nose, the riding on the broom, the black coat, the pointy hat. Where did all these come from? These visual elements are so ingrained in our cultural consciousness that even a child can draw a witch and will all immediately recognize what it is. As stories of witches have been told and retold throughout the years, artists dating back to the Middle Ages have also created depictions with features that look strangely familiar to us today. But how do these specific visual tropes become standardized? The hooked nose in witch depictions come from a troubling mix of artistic tradition, anti-Semitic stereotypes, and symbolic associations with age and evil. In medieval and early modern Europe, witches were often depicted as elderly women with exaggerated features, including long, hooked noses, and this became visual shorthand for age, ugliness, and moral corruption. The idea was that the inner evil manifested as outer deformity. If you were bad on the inside, it would show on the outside. Unfortunately, the hooked nose or a pointed nose were also common features in anti-Semitic caricatures. During periods of intense witch persecution, especially in the 15th through the 17th centuries, Jews faced similar accusations of devil worship and malevolent magic. The visual stereotypes overlapped, with both groups depicted with exaggerated facial features, including prominent hooked noses. This is one of those uncomfortable historical truths that reveals just how interconnected various forms of prejudice and scapegoating really were. By the time the Brothers Grimm fairy tale in the late 19th century and later Halloween imagery in the 20th century, the witch with a pointed nose has become a standard visual trope. Artists copied from earlier works, cementing this as the archetypal witch appearance. The pointed nose may also suggest something sharp or unnatural or animalistic, fitting the conception of witches as beings who abandoned humanity for demonic powers and practices. It's worth noting that the actual historical witch trials rarely describe accused witches in this way. Most were ordinary-looking people. The exaggerated features were artistic concepts. But once these took hold in the popular imagination, they became more real than reality itself. Although most witches who were accused during this period were not practicing Jews, in fact, a very small portion of them were. Nonetheless, these stereotypical pictures overlapped and coincided with one another. What about the broomstick? Perhaps the most iconic accessory in the witch's arsenal, but why a broom? Why not a shovel or a pitchfork or literally any other household item? The earliest known image of witches on brooms dates all the way back to 1451, when two illustrations appeared in the French poet Martin Lafrance's manuscript Defender of the Ladies, showing one woman soaring through the air on a broom and another flying aboard a plain white stick. There are several theories for why the broomstick became associated with witches, and honestly, they're all kind of fascinating in their own little weird ways. Theory number one is pagan fertility rituals. Anthropologist Robin Skelton suggests that the association between witches and brooms may have roots in pagan fertility rituals, in which rural farmers would leap and dance astride poles, pitchforks or brooms in the light of the full moon to encourage the growth of crops. This broomstick dance became confused with common accounts of witches flying through the air on their way to orgies and other illicit meetings. So basically, farmers hopping around their fields on sticks got reinterpreted as devil-worshipping witches flying to demonic sabbats, as one does. Brooms at the time were associated with female domesticity, but in artistic depictions involving witches and brooms, there's a lot of suggestive behavior going on with them, and so this mixing of the female wifely motherly duties with sexual empowerment was seen as kind of a toxic brew. It was a way to invert this symbol and to make it into something very different than it was originally intended for, similar to the cauldron. You know, the cauldron was something that you would normally cook food in, but a witch, rather than cooking food to enrich and nourish her family, would create harmful potions instead. Theory number 3 is hallucinogenic ointments, and now we get to the really weird part. Medieval European witches had access to various hallucinogenic plants, including rye mold, which contained ergot, henbane, and deadly nightshade, and mandrake. According to Johann Weyer in 1563, these were all principal ingredients in the witch's flying ointment. But here's the thing, drinking such potent witch's brew could actually make the drinker quite sick and could even be deadly, so the hallucinogenic drugs were instead absorbed through mucous membranes signs. Historical confessions are quite explicit about this from a 1324 investigation. And rifling through the closet of a lady, they found a pipe of ointment wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin. And from the 15th century records, the vulgar believe and witches confess that on certain days or nights they anoint a staff and ride on it to the appointed place, or anoint themselves under the arms and in other hairy places. A 1966 description by Gustav Schenk of the tropane alkaloid hallucinogen effects reported, "Each part of my body seemed to be going off on its own, and I was seized with a fear that I was falling apart. At the same time, I experienced an intoxicating sensation of flying." So the flying was likely both metaphorical, representing domestic and sexual symbolism, and literal, actual hallucinogenic experiences from topically applied drugs. The broomstick served both of the application method for the hallucinogenic ointment and the object that appeared in their drug-induced visions of flight. The herbs used in such preparations would have been kept in small broom-like bundles known as whisks, which may have been boiled whole in oil, both releasing the active ingredients and soaking the handle with the concoction. It's kind of darkly amusing in a way. The broomstick became a perfect symbol combining women's domestic role, suspected pagan practices, sexual anxieties, and possibly actual hallucinogenic experiences, all wrapped into one powerful image that stuck in the cultural imagination for centuries. Lastly, what about the black cat? And now we come to perhaps the most enduring symbol of witchcraft. The black cat, the loyal familiar, the demonic companion, the shape-shifting servant of darkness who prowls by the witch's side. But why cats, and why specifically black ones? The association between cats and witchcraft emerged during the Middle Ages, but it wasn't always cats specifically. The concept of the familiar, or a demonic spirit in animal form that assisted witches in their magic work, could take many shapes. Dogs, toads, birds, rats, really any creature theoretically could be a witch's familiar. But cats, especially black ones, became the most iconic. Part of this has to do with cats themselves. They have those unsettling reflective eyes in the dark. They move silently, they're predators that toy with their prey. Everything about cat behavior, especially at night, makes them seem mysterious and otherworldly. Cats were also strongly associated with women, particularly women who lived alone. Widows, spinsters, herbalists, midwives, these were often the same women who ended up being accused of witchcraft. They kept cats as companions and for pest control because, practical reasons. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the witch hunts, the cat became evidence. A woman living alone with a cat was suspicious. Multiple cats? Definitely a witch. The link between cats and the demonic was solidified by Pope Gregory IX in 1233 when he issued a papal decree called Vox in Rama, which associated cats, particularly black cats, with devil worship and heretical acts. According to allegations in this document, members of a German heretical group, of course it's always German, members of a German heretical group would kiss a black cat on its behind as a part of their initiation ceremony, and that Satan himself would appear in the form of a black cat. This kicked off centuries of cat persecution throughout Europe. Cats were killed en masse, especially black ones. They were burned, drowned, thrown from towers during festivals. The superstition spread that black cats were either witches in disguise who were shape-shifting or demonic spirits that served witches as spies or assistants. The irony here is almost too perfect. Europe's war on cats likely contributed to the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century because with fewer cats around to control the rodent population, plague-carrying rats flourished. So the very superstition meant to protect people from evil actually helped to facilitate one of the worst disasters in human history. Good job, everyone. In witch trial records, accused witches were often reported to have cats, and witnesses would testify about seeing the accused talking to their cats or feeding them. These everyday interactions between a person and their pet were reinterpreted as evidence of demonic communications. The cat wasn't a companion, it was a familiar spirit. Feeding it wasn't care, it was a blood pact. The woman wasn't lonely, she was in league with Satan. The black cat's connection with bad luck probably stems from this same period. If a black cat crossed your path, it might be a witch in disguise. Scouting for victims or casting spells, better to avoid it entirely. This superstition persisted long after the witch hunts ended, and even today, black cats are less likely to be adopted from shelters than cats of other colors, a legacy of medieval paranoia that continues to affect living animals to this day. Let's get to the reason that we're probably still talking about witches all the way to today. Probably the reason that we're still talking about witches today is the role that they've played in storytelling. The witch is now one of the strongest female archetypes in all of Western literature. Carl Jung thought that witches had become a shadow of our collective unconscious. This maps nicely onto the history of witch hunts. These marginal women on the outside of society were made to bear the weight of the deepest fears and anxieties of their accusers. And in doing so, a powerful creative image was produced. So too in stories, witches, when they are villains, are manifestations of the greatest evil that a writer can conjure up. Every great story needs a great villain. The Weird Sisters in Macbeth are one of my favorite examples of this. Their lines sound so modern. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn, and cauldron bubble. Here we already have such a powerful image of witches that we're familiar with. In the story, they act as the catalyst of fate and of prophecy, sealing Macbeth's doom. And there are many more examples. Arthurian legends, Grimm's fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen, all of which witches play slightly different but mostly malevolent roles. But witches in stories were not just a feature of the Renaissance or the late medieval period. They continue far beyond that, and they have become arguably even more prevalent today. To me, the most iconic image of a witch in any fictional narrative is in The Wizard of Oz. In the 1939 movie version of The Wizard of Oz, The Wicked Witch of the West. I have such strong memories of seeing her as a child and being scared out of my mind. And to this day, I think she's one of the coolest villains ever. She's pure evil, a malevolent force with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. She's jealous, she's cruel, she commands an army of flying monkeys. She's terrifying to children and represents a kind of uncomplicated villainy that makes for great storytelling. She's the kind of villain that a child would be completely enraptured and fascinated with, but would probably bore an adult. And unfortunately, adults who try to put their hat in with this story tend to make it more lame, I think. That's just my opinion. But even here, in this seemingly straightforward depiction, there's something interesting going on. The Wicked Witch isn't powerful because she's made a deal with the devil or practices dark magic in the Christian sense. She's powerful in her own right. She's a force of nature, and she's defeated not by masculine strength or holy righteousness, but by Dorothy, a small little girl armed with nothing but a bucket of water. I think Harry Potter is another interesting example of storytelling with witches. If you think about the entire story of Harry Potter, the bad guys in the story, the Bellatrix Lestranges and the Voldemorts, despise muggles. And you can kind of see from their perspective why they would. Why would they want to get along with people who burned their ancestors at the stake, right? So from that perspective, you can kind of see why they wouldn't like muggles. Where the good guys in the story are wanting to reconcile and forgive or create a new society in which these two races of individuals can mix into one harmonious whole. And so you can see even implied in J.K. Rowling's story is this dynamic and this push and pull between the scapegoating of witches and the legacy of scapegoating those witches, and how witches of modern day period are to regard that scapegoating, either lingering animosity that's boiling into a hatred of muggles, or on the good guys' part, a desire to forgive and move forward into a new society in which muggles and witches and wizards can all live together. But clearly these symbols of magic and treachery still play a huge role in our imagination to this day. And so the question I think we still have to wrestle with is, why did we invent them? What purpose do they serve in our imagination? And I think the answer is complex and layered. On one level, we invented witches because we needed someone to blame. When crops failed, when children died, when inexplicable illness struck, when life became unbearable, we needed a reason. We needed it to be someone's fault. The witch became the perfect scapegoat, marginal enough to be expendable, mysterious enough to be believable as a source of supernatural evil, and convenient enough to serve the political and social purposes of those in power. On another level, I think we invented witches because we were genuinely trying to make sense of real phenomenon that we didn't understand. People did practice folk magic. They did use herbs and potions. They did have strange visions and experiences, some of them possibly induced by hallucinogenic substances. In a world without scientific explanations for mental illness, epilepsy, ergot poisoning, and 1,000 other conditions, supernatural explanations filled the void. On yet another level, we invented witches because we feared female power. power. The association between witches and women is no accident. Women who were too independent, too knowledgeable, too outspoken, too old to be useful, or too young and attractive to be controlled, all of them could be labeled as witches. The witch trials were in many cases a way of reinforcing control over women. And not only this, but in a patriarchal society in which male power is sort of obvious and female power has to go underground, it would make sense that these things bubble and flower to the surface in these manifestations. But here's what's fascinating. The witch refuses to die. We keep reinventing her, reimagining her, reclaiming her. She's been a monster, a victim, a hero, a rebel, a wise woman, a symbol of female empowerment. She's been evil incarnate, and she's been misunderstood and persecuted. She's terrified us and inspired us. The witch endures because she represents something essential and eternal. The outsider, the person with power that others fear, the scapegoat, the rebel, the healer, the destroyer. She's a mirror we hold up to society, reflecting back our fears and fantasies about power, about gender, about good and evil, about what happens to those who don't fit in. The historical witches, the ones who were tortured and executed during the trials, they were mostly innocent people caught up in a moral panic. They deserve to be remembered with compassion and a sober historical understanding of the injustice that was done to them. And it's a lesson for us to learn historically today. Who are the groups that are scapegoated for today's problems? There's probably not one answer to this. Different cultures have different answers and different dynamics that go on. But the fictional witches, the ones in our stories, they're still working their magic on our imaginations. They're still asking uncomfortable questions about power and prejudice, and about who gets to decide what's good and what's evil, and about what we do to those who are different. She's one of our oldest stories, and she shows no signs of disappearing anytime soon. Because maybe deep down we still need her. Not as a scapegoat this time, but as a reminder. A reminder that power can be used for good or evil, that those who are persecuted might be innocent. We invented witches because we needed to make sense of a confusing, frightening, and terrible world, and we keep inventing them over and over again for exactly the same reason. The witch ultimately is a storytelling device, both in history and in fiction. And that's what I think is most fascinating about the witch. In history, she's a scapegoat, which brings to mind all the ways, people, and things that we tend to scapegoat today. But I think ultimately, the witch has gained power as a symbol because of the violence historically done to her by the scapegoating mechanism at the hands of a Christianity that claimed that it was doing away with scapegoating violence. I think the irony there cemented spiritually wed witches with the concept of Christianity, at least in the Western world. In many ways, Christianity and witches are mere reflections of one another. Refusing to scapegoat is easier said than done. Taking responsibility for the pain in your own life, even when it's maybe undeserved, rather than blaming somebody else. Ask yourself the question, who do you blame for things when things go wrong? In a related way, but in a slightly different way. She's a tableau of our ideas of evil and villainy. And in that way, what villains do we conjure up in our own stories? Who do you tend to scapegoat? What fears and anxieties do you project upon those? What do you fear? Thanks for watching this video. Hopefully I can find my way back home. I'm a little lost. So if I don't post another video for a while, you know why. Wish me luck. This is Dan Doug, everybody. Stay cool.